All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Hello and welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. My name is Danielle Barnes. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the CEO of Women Talk Design. I'm going to get us kicked off with the format. I will introduce you to our speaker shortly, but a couple of logistics. We do have automated live captioning on, so if you want to follow along with captions, you can turn that on your Zoom. We're also recording this session because afterwards we will be sharing a write-up and have the recording. And so I wanted to throw that out there so that you see this happening. If you haven't been to our Speaker Stories event before, the reason that we do this event is really to be able to highlight different speakers in the Women Talk Design community and share their journeys to public speaking, what they've learned along the way, and the advice that they have for other folks who are just getting started or looking to do more within their public speaking time. And I'm really thrilled today that we scheduled this event, not even realizing really that today is International Women's Day. So it feels fitting to be able to highlight and have this event today. And I'm thrilled for us to be talking to Chimmy Kalu, who is a UX designer who works with companies that really put people first, helping them create products that solve real problems. And she's a true advocate for accessibility, believing that it shouldn't just be a nice to have, it's not a dirty word, that inclusive design practices really need to be integrated as the baseline. And that's a lot of the work that she talks about. Chimmy is able to translate user needs and technical limitations based on working as a software engineer for half of her career. And over the last decade, Chimmy has worked with heritage brands like British Airways, Vogue, and GQ to help transform their offerings and deliver pioneer products and experiences for their users. So Chimmy writes and speaks and teaches about UX and UI and inclusive design around the world. She's spoken at events like the AIGA conference, the UX conference, Product Camp, and several more. And I'm thrilled to have her here today. So please join me in welcoming Chimmy.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to meet you all.
Thanks so much for being here. So I want to get started, Chimmy, by hearing from you. Why do you speak? This is something we talk a lot about with folks in our community when they're getting started and trying to figure out what they should speak about, and all of that. We always start with our why, and so I'd love to hear a little bit more about your why and why it's important that you speak.
Well, aside from the fact that I like talking, I feel like I have a specific experience or set of experiences that are interesting to share. So I have a point of view, and I think that I like sort of sharing those because people talk to me about them privately, and I speak so that they can go a little bit wider than just my friends.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that point of view. What are some of the topics that you're speaking about right now, and why are they important to you?
Right, so I mostly speak about design. I'm obsessed with design. I love design and I just can't stop talking about it. So I suppose within that context, I speak about sort of process. So think design ops, design efficiency, things to help people with their design process, particularly for those that are younger in their design career. I also talk about accessibility a lot. So I guess people are often overwhelmed by accessibility or think that accessibility sort of is a very, very big thing that they need to tackle. So I try to help people understand that you can do your part, even if the rest of the world isn't going along. And my final thing that I love speaking about is lovable products. I love products. I love to talk about products I love, experiences that I love, and how other people can create those experiences that people would love.
Great. So it sounds like you have a range of topics that you speak about, but a couple that you feel really strongly about, and that's awesome. I'd love to hear more about your journey into public speaking. And so to get started, I'm wondering if you can reflect back to your first public speaking experience and what was that opportunity? How did you get it? What was that like? Would just love to hear some of the details about it.
Right. So we'll start with, it's probably not so obvious these days, but I was really shy as a kid. And so I had to give a speech at my high school graduation, and I was literally trembling as I gave that speech. Fast forward sort of a decade later when I'm working, and I got to the point of my career where I started sort of presenting findings from UX research to my company. And after I'd done that a few times, I started thinking, oh my God, like while I'm nervous about writing sort of high school speeches, I'm okay when it comes to talking about design. So I asked if I could speak at the School of UX. So I teach design at the School of UX, and the same person who runs that runs the UX conference. And so I asked if I could do my first talk there. That was my entry into proper public speaking.
Great. So you knew someone that you had already been working out with and reached out and said, hey, can I give this talk?
Yes, I guess I felt a little bit more confident going to him because he already knew that I run sort of workshops every month with him.
Yeah.
And so it felt like he wouldn't question my ability to do a talk if I started with him. So that's how I got it.
Yeah. And how did you start teaching with them to begin with?
Oh, I love teaching. Like, I feel like if teaching were better paid, that's precisely what I should be doing with my life, just teaching and nothing else. But after I'd been a designer for a while, I started wondering, surely it must be possible to teach some of the stuff that I already know. So I literally Googled where to teach design in London, and a couple of places came up. I applied to him, to General Assembly, I think, and maybe one other. And he was the only person that gave me a chance with my complete lack of experience in doing such a thing.
Yeah, that's great. So you Googled, you found someone, you reached out, and that led to then this first talk as well. I'm curious to hear more about the experience of giving that first talk. So once you reached out and you confirmed it, how did it go? Right? And how did it feel?
I think by the standards I hold myself to, I would probably say it was a disaster. So I had this clever idea that I wasn't going to memorize my slides or anything. I would just have my slides as a teaching aid, and I'd go onto the stage with flashcards, which I was going to put on the podium and sort of surreptitiously slide through. It wasn't surreptitious enough. I think everyone knew that I was looking at my flashcards as I gave that talk. And I can't remember what that talk was about, actually. But yes, no, I don't think it went very well.
Okay, but you kept speaking. So what made you decide to continue to either seek out or say yes to opportunities, even if you felt like that first opportunity didn't go as well?
Right, so I guess there are two things that are true about me. The first is that I like a challenge. Upward curves are my friend. I like anything that shows me trending up. And two is that as long as I'm not worse than average, I will push on with something. So I assessed myself to not have performed worse than an average newbie to speaking, and therefore decided to give it another go with a touch more preparation.
Yeah. And how long ago was that first experience?
I think 2016. So we are coming up to 4 years or something like that. It was in fact in February. It was in February 2016.
Oh yeah, more. I think 6 years at this point, right?
Oh yeah.
What year are we in? It's so confusing.
Actually, I think I have actually misremembered this. My first talk was actually a talk in Berlin with my then. Yeah, it was 2016. But the thing I just told you now is from 2018. So it was 2016 and it was in Germany. So I did my first talk as an English speaking person to a mixed audience in Germany. But I was sort of speaking with my boss. So I guess I forget that's my first talk. Like, it didn't really feel like my talk, like I was a co-talker.
Yeah. And that's a whole other experience, is co-presenting. Is that something you enjoyed and would recommend to other people, or do you prefer presenting alone?
I think I'd like both, although I haven't done collaborative speaking as much as I do individual speaking. but I do like both because I'm quite, I appreciate multiple perspectives. And so if I can possibly provide two perspectives or more of any given topic, I'm super interested in doing it. So I'm actually doing another collaborative talk in a few weeks.
Oh, great. What is that one?
It's how to balance thinking and feeling when you're doing creative work. So I'm a thinker and my co-presenter is a feeler, and we work together a lot, and that has its challenges. So we thought we'd share some of our findings from adjusting our process over the last few years.
Oh, I love that. Thinking about like, what is this value that someone else can add, a perspective that you don't have, and then bringing them in to give that talk as well.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you find your speaking opportunities or how you choose them. At this point, now that you've done some speaking, is it mostly folks reaching out to you? Are you applying? Are you reaching out? And what does that process look like for you?
It's a mix. Sometimes folks reach out to me. So I did the AIGA conference because they reached out to me, for example. But I also have certain conferences that are on my radar, the sort of conferences I'd love to speak to. And so I will cycle through thinking about applying to them, and sometimes apply to them if my checking aligns with when the request for proposals come through. I have actually used Women Talk Design as a source of information for RFPs when I've done it. Is that what they're called?
Yeah. RFPs or call for proposals, they're different titles, but that's a good plug. If y'all are looking for call for speakers, we send a newsletter and share updates there. And we also have it in our community space. I'm curious, is there like certain things that you look for in an event to say like, I want to speak there? Or is it really just, it's an event that I've been wanting to attend, and so that's when I'll apply to?
Right. So it's two things. It's either there's a conference with subject matter that I'm really passionate about, in which case I want to attend and speak at those kinds of conferences. I think there's Bottom Design Conference, which is sort of one of the ones that's on my radar. But as long as I live in London, it feels like it's not, I haven't yet found the perfect fit talk-wise for that one, but that's on my radar. And so things like that, the sort of big UX conferences, I kind of pay attention to them and where they're happening. The other thing is also if it happens to be in London or online, and it aligns with something that I'm interested in talking about, then that also becomes an interesting reason to either speak at or apply for that. Something that I get invited to would be something like Nomensa's conferences or the UX tech conference as well, because they're very, very aligned with the subjects that I speak about.
Yeah, awesome. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your process for preparing talks and practicing for them. So what does that look like when you either asked to speak somewhere, you applied and were accepted, and then what does that process look like from the time that moment happens to the time that you actually present?
Yes. Let's say I've improved over time. But
yeah, you can share that evolution as well. I'm curious about that.
I pick a topic that I want to speak about, and I kind of prepare an outline of that topic. So typically it will be in my notes or in Google Docs or whatever it is. Then if I feel confident enough about the outline, then I'll find somewhere to do that talk for the first time. Typically, I want to do the talk somewhere smaller. So whether it's other people's workplaces, my workplace, we have a learning hour, or something familiar, I do a small version of the talk just to make sure that there is a story and it's worth sort of putting the effort into. And if that's successful, then I will expand the talk to suit different lengths of talk. So sometimes I do a 10-minute talk or 30-minute talk or 45-minute talk, all based around the same message. So that would be my process. Over time, I have put a little bit more preparation into the presentation of the talk, so that I at least know the flow of the content as we go through the slides. But I very rarely memorize the whole talk, because I like to speak about something for which I'm extremely comfortable. So that's why I do a lot of design talks, as opposed to some, sort of any other topic for which I might not be as well informed or educated.
Yeah. I love this process that you have of finding a smaller group to speak in front of first. And it's great that you have opportunities at work to do that. Do you set it up a certain way that says, do you tell everyone in advance, like, I'm looking for feedback? Do you have them share it at the end? Do you have them like follow up with you? How do you get that feedback that you're looking for?
Maybe it's my personality, but people feel very confident giving me feedback.
They just volunteer it at the end.
They volunteer feedback. So I have a couple of sort of mentees or peers that I will occasionally ask to join. So if I'm doing it at work, I have the other designer join me and give feedback on whatever the material is. My partner is also a very important source of feedback, typically. If there's a recording, I'll play it back and say, what are your thoughts? And if there's no recording, then I just get her to watch me and tell me what she thought or what I should change.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And I'm curious too, as you're building this talk from, a small to something longer, this is something I hear a lot from folks that we work with is, how do you think about the difference between a 10-minute talk or a 45-minute talk? Do you have a process for how you expand that, or is it really different depending on the presentation?
So someone told me, I want to say in 2018, when I was sort of trying to perfect my speaking a little bit more, that the key to seeming natural, no matter what you present, is to always think about your core message. So no matter what topic I'm doing, I have the 1-minute version of that talk as a mental. What is the thing I want someone who listens to me for just 1 minute to take away? What do I want someone who's listening to me for 10 minutes to take away? And so on and so forth. So if I know what the core message is, then I will build the outline around that core message and decide through that workshopping process what elements help with the core message or detract from it.
Yeah, awesome. And I know you've done speaking both online and in person, and I'm curious if you have a preference and if anything changes in the way that you prepare or the way that you show up for in person or virtual.
I'm just going to tell you now that I love this form of virtual conversation where I can actually see faces. The first time I did one of those virtual talks where there is no one's cameras on, I was in shock. I was quite because I try to be a little bit funny and I need people to give me feedback on my tiny bits of funniness. So I do not love virtual conferences where I cannot see people. I've got better at them in terms of how I tolerate. In person would probably still be my favorite. So I like people. I like being able to engage with the audience and adjust the way that I do the talk based on how people respond to certain elements. So that would be my favorite by far. But one of my favorite things about the pandemic is the fact that we have this world where you can do both the virtual and the in-person, sometimes at the same conference.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm curious, do you have any rituals that you do right before you present and anything that you do after you present as a way to kind of close things out or celebrate or just transition out of the talk?
No, the only ritual I have is to make sure I jump on or do some sort of mental prep walkthrough of the talk, just not like immediately before the talk, but perhaps on the morning of the talk or a few hours before the talk, just to make sure that there's nothing that I want to change at that late stage. But no, I never thought about my transition. I kind of just like shut my camera and be like, well, that's done.
Even just saying it's over, that can be a transition as well, Yeah. And we
Yeah.
have a question in the chat from Muncie. And folks, I encourage you, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature if you want to unmute and ask Chimmy directly. I have some more questions, but I want to also start to open it up to Q&A. So Muncie wants to know how your topics emerge and if you have a signature talk. So I know you mentioned that you talk about UX topics, but even just kind of within that, how do you come up with your topics? And Muncie also wanted to know, what is your point of view on having different topics versus re-giving signature talks? So we can start with the first one of coming up with topics, and then basically how often do you reuse that versus coming up with something else?
So design is trendy, I guess. Design is a trendy kind of field where there are certain topics that become topical at any given time. When I'm doing talks, I try to make sure that whatever I'm talking about is current and relevant. So giving the same talk over and over again perhaps might not be suited unless I have new angles for that talk, if I'm going to design conferences. What do I talk about? I really talk about things that I love. I'm super passionate about design. So whatever's currently floating my boat is what I focus on. Let me think about what I've done this year. So I'm doing accessibility on Thursday. I'm doing this talk that I talked about, which is a new one. So this is a new talk. Another thing I've introduced this year is designing for complexity. I mentor lots of people who are coming into design, and usually they'll take my workshops, or I meet them in some other circle of design interactions, and they have a number of questions that they ask me. Once I'm getting the same question from multiple people, that becomes the basis of a talk. So the designing for complexity came because I've answered the same question to 4 or 5 of my mentees recently. So I'm like, well, clearly if 4 or 5 of my very small pool of mentees are asking this, other people must be asking this, and therefore this is worth considering as a talk idea. And I think that's generally how most of my new ideas come. Is like, I find I've been talking about the same thing. I'm like, well, that looks like a talk, because lots of people are interested in this subject at the moment. So I'll make that a talk, assuming it actually works out as something that I have a very specific point of view on.
Yeah, I love that as a technique of thinking about what is someone constantly asking me, and using that to share with others. And for that topic, did you have an upcoming event that you were looking for a topic for, and that's how you match that up? Or did you come up with the topic and then say, I want to find a place where I can deliver this?
I think for that one, actually, I had just started turning it into a talk when I got a request to do a talk for a conference. And so I sent them my list of talks and said, here's the one I'm thinking of doing, but if that's not a good fit, I can do any of these other talks. And they picked the new one. So that was a good signal to carry on in that direction. So I've done that one publicly now once, and I want to refine it a little bit and see what happens the next time I talk about it.
Yeah. And a logistic question, I'm curious, when you're sharing these topics with an organizer, so if they reach out, are you saying like, here is the title, or here is the kind of one sentence about it? Do you have kind of a full proposal for each topic? How much information do you share in those cases?
So probably just a summary. I like to call it a social media summary, Twitter summary. Mm-hmm. A quick snapshot of what I'm going to talk about. Generally, I will build that simple version with what's the problem that this talk will address, and what will be the outcome for anyone who listens to it, because I think that's easy to summarize in a couple of sentences. And just whet someone's appetite, I suppose, for the topic. Sometimes, I mean, obviously, if I'm doing a full call for proposal application, then I'll go into a little bit more detail around the topic, probably, but I don't go too much into detail because, quite frankly, a lot of the time I submit the request, then build a talk. Unless it's one of my, so signature talks would be practical accessibility, which I seem to give at least once a year. And I think that's my current only signature. I don't think that there's anything else that I've done several times in any year so far. But if people don't want the signature, then I'll build a new perspective around whatever subject that the conference is focused on.
Yeah. And do you see that as your signature is because it's just the topic that you really care about right now that you want to be sharing with folks?
Yes and no. So I see it as my signature because, unfortunately, it's still required. In my ideal world, I would not need to tell anyone how to start with accessibility in 2022. Do you know what I mean? So the fact that it's still required, and I think one of the reasons I still give it is that many of the design curricula don't include accessibility as part of the process. So tomorrow I'm giving a talk at an old colleague's workplace because they don't have an accessibility practice or point of view as an organization. So I have to tell them what to do to kind of start moving towards accessibility, even if they don't have organizational buy-in. And so that's why that talk, it continues to be relevant because people keep asking me if I'll come and do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an important reminder for us too, for folks who are worried about a topic being talked about too much. It's like, if it still needs to be talked about, then you can talk about it and you should talk about it, even if other people are talking about it.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. As a reminder, folks, feel free to use the raise hand feature or drop questions in the chat. We want to make sure that you can get your questions answered as well, in addition to the ones that I have prepared, but I do have several more for you, Chimmy.
Okay.
I'm curious, has anything ever gone wrong when you presented? So either in person or virtual, we want to hear some of your horror stories if you have them.
Yes. So I gave a talk maybe just before the pandemic at Women Driven Design. And so it didn't feel like it when I did the talk, but when I watched the video later, I was horrified. It seemed like I'd been running miles. I was panting the entire time, which I consider to be a horror show because I'm like, how did I not notice? Could everyone else hear this? Or has the microphone just picked it up because it was so close to me? And this was one talk where I was pacing up and down because I'd seen somewhere that it was advisable to pace. Note that I have not paced since because clearly pacing does not suit my presentation style. What else has gone wrong? A few technical things where something went wrong with the technical element, particularly when I did lots of virtual things. But the worst was a talk that didn't happen because I'd forgotten I was teaching. So an hour before the talk, the day of the talk, I go into my calendar and it's my monthly invitation that I'm teaching a workshop. It's a paid workshop. I can't cancel that. There's the conference, and I had to send my apology. And that was probably the most horrific thing that has happened to me, really, was that complete lack of awareness of what my calendar looked like.
Yeah. And I'm curious for that, or even just some of the technical stuff that goes wrong. Like, how do you handle that in the moment, especially when nerves are running high and, maybe it's a pretty anxiety producing situation?
I guess maybe I think most people don't really care about these things. We all think we're human. So I've never once had someone speaking and something went wrong and I went, oh dear, so unprofessional. So I just give the same sort of grace to myself as I give other people. And if it's not a camera or if it's something to do with slides, I will say something like, oh my goodness, I have no idea what's going on. I am a technophobe, so I'm constantly apologizing. Really weird considering I'm a designer who works in tech, but I feel like I have more than my fair share of tech issues, and I'm shameless in letting everyone know that something's gone wrong.
I mean, I love this idea so much of giving yourself the grace that you would give other people. That's such a good reminder. I think we often forget that. Yeah. And I'm curious too, thinking of kind of the bigger picture of speaking, how has public speaking had an impact on your career?
So I work as a freelancer some of the time, and I feel like I never really have to pitch my work because people will find me, I guess, because if you Google me, you have something that you find. It's also helped with people finding me to be their mentor, I think. And I guess it helps with a little bit of, if I'm feeling down about myself, I just go back and watch a little video and I'm like, I'm not so bad at design. I managed to give a talk about this topic, so that's okay.
Yeah.
So cheer me up.
Do you have feedback that you save from people too? Do you have like a little thing that you can go back to with feedback?
Yes. So sometimes I'll have a talk where there's a sidebar with like comments or chats. Sometimes people have taken a screenshot of that for me and sent it over. I have a little document I like to call my hype doc. And whenever I receive good feedback, I try to put that immediately into my hype doc. And sometimes I'll take a screenshot out of any of those kind of things myself if I'm watching the video.
Yeah, I like that. We all need a hype doc. Follow Chimmy's lead on that one. That's great. And we have a question from Mansi. Mansi, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm taking up all the question space.
No, it's great.
Chimmy, nice. Thank you so much for sharing all the stories that you're sharing. I wanted to follow up on something that you said about the question Danielle asked on the impact that speaking has had on your career. Because I think I'm at a place in my life that you were maybe in 5 years ago where you were freelancing and maybe pitching at the same time, and speaking became part of that. So I'm curious to hear if you made speaking a priority at that time, intentionally and strategically, and how you did that, or like, how did that come to be where you realized that, hey, if I'm speaking, then I don't need to pitch, or the other way around, or maybe it wasn't strategic, but yeah, just any stories around that would be great.
Right. So the first one is that it was consequential. I didn't actually plan that bit, but in general, I'm quite the planner. I used to have sort of a 10, 20-year plan that was pretty filled for the first 5 years. I'm kind of vague, going further out. And I think I got to a point where I was preparing to emigrate to Canada without a job. And I thought it's probably a good thing to focus on speaking a little bit, to give me something other than just my portfolio, to convince someone in a whole other continent to think about me. So that was probably one time that I prioritized speaking. I set intentions for my year. So sometimes a year will come into focus where I feel like I want to do a little bit more speaking. So this year, for example, I've put speaking on my intentions for the year with no consequence. Like, it's not directly tied to my career. It's just in this year, I feel like the thing I want to prioritize is doing a little bit more speaking. And I think I've also done that at other times in my life. But the getting work because people have other things that I do, particularly because I speak about design. I think because I'm super passionate about design. And if you spoke to me on the phone, I sound incredibly dull and lifeless. But when you see me in life or doing this, it becomes obvious that I'm not dull and mechanical. So I think having a video for people to sort of get a little bit more about my personality, independent of an email or other mechanism through which I appear very dull, has been helpful, I suppose.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
As a follow-up to your intention this year of doing more public speaking, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your future public speaking goals. If you have any events that are on your radar that you want to speak at, or any other type of kind of milestones that you're looking ahead and you're like, that would be a dream. That's the goal.
Right. So I think my favorite session that I've ever given, my favorite talk I've ever given, was at the AIGA conference in Pasadena, in whenever it was. Unfortunately for me, I was next door to Debbie Millman. So when people had a choice to go to Debbie Millman or me, they weren't so keen on me, alas. So one of the things that I wanted to do was sort of I need a body of work, I suppose. I want there to be a cohesiveness to the things that I talk about, such that, so my intention, I'll tell you now, was to give a keynote this year. That's the intention I set for this year, because I've never given a keynote. And so it's a very specific thing. I've already ticked it off, but alas, I wasn't very specific in my intention. So I've corrected it so the universe can pay attention. And I've said a in-person keynote, because I did a virtual keynote.
Yeah. And for that talk with AIGA, I think you said they reached out to you, right? Do you know how they found you?
I honestly can't remember. So I think it might have been, actually, it may have been because I was working a lot with Adobe at the time. So I was doing lots of Adobe events. So potentially through there, or I'd just spoken at the UX conference and accessibility was topical at the time. So I think maybe something, I actually have no idea. I don't think I asked. It seems like people ask questions about how people find them. I keep forgetting to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think that talk is recorded, so we can send it out afterwards as well. So even though you couldn't get everyone there in person, we can continue to share it for folks to watch the recording afterward. Yeah. And we're all rooting for you with your in-person keynote. I know it's such a strange thing that we are starting to present in person again. Do you have other in-person things lined up or not yet?
So the conference in Nashville, it's a copywriters conference. And I'm I was going to go to Poland, but I'm not 100% sure whether I should be going to Poland at this time. So I'm kind of on pause at the moment until I know a bit more.
Yeah.
But I haven't really sort of looked at anything later in the year, so I should probably do that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple in-person conferences now, but most of them are planning later on in the year. So yeah, cool. And you shared so much great advice through your own experiences and your own story throughout. But I wanted to ask about the best advice that you've been given around public speaking. I'm actually also curious about if you received any bad advice. So if there's like any worst advice that you're like, this is what I was told, but don't listen to this. And also, what your best advice is that you were given and want to pass along.
Right. So the first thing I'll do is do a little caveat. When people give advice, you really need to decide whether the advice is for you. This is something that my grandpa used to tell me when he was alive. Look at the perspective of the person giving the advice to decide whether you should take the advice. So the one that's good is one I've mentioned already, which is to think about the subject of any presentation, whether it's a talk or it's a presentation in your workplace. Think about what are the core messages, or what is the core message, and make sure that you have a strategy for any length of time that you have, because you can go on thinking that you're doing a 30-minute talk and have tech issues and have to deliver it in 15 minutes. You have to have a strategy for that. So thinking about your core message so that you can adapt to anything is probably my favorite bit of advice that I've ever got. And the worst, of course, is the pacing that didn't go so well for me. But of course, it works for other people. So it's not bad universally, it's just bad for me.
Yeah. No, I like that idea of figuring out what works for you, right? We're all different as speakers and just as humans. And so finding what works for you. There's a lot of bad advice out there, I think, in general. So that's why I always like to ask people about that.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to know what's bad advice, because if you
Mm.
Google things, people can seem like such authorities. So I try my best. One of the reasons for the little workshops that I do is if I'm taking on something new, some piece of advice, I want that safe space to test out the thing, which is where I went wrong with my pacing, that I did not pace ever before I did that pacing in person. And I've learned from that mistake.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you have any advice for folks on how to find those opportunities? I know that you mentioned that you've practiced at work or you've practiced with your partner, but for people who maybe don't see kind of like a built-in opportunity to practice, how might they create their own before they, speak somewhere bigger or maybe higher stakes?
Right. So I'm assuming that most people who want to speak have a community. So whether it's a workplace that you're part of, or I'm hoping some sort of online, I don't know what to call it, online community. My partner's a freelancer and joins all these virtual communities, which provide a nice opportunity to test out a new idea, especially if it's one that allows you to have little offshoots of small groups. So for me, number one is you always have some colleagues that are rooting for you. They're always a nice place to start. So whether I introduce a learning hour or I just ask people to come around to a session where I provide donuts or whatever, that would be my safest opportunity to go with people that I'm not so familiar with, but not completely unfamiliar with.
Yeah. Okay, my last question, unless anyone else has one they want to add into the chat or raise their hand, is specifically for new speakers. And I love that you like to speak to folks who are maybe earlier in design too. And I'm curious, for someone who maybe is not sure if they should speak or if they have anything to share, what, I know you gave so much great advice about, crafting the talk and practicing and things like that. But I'm curious if even that starting point of, should I be speaking? Does anyone want to hear from me? How can I figure out what I should share? What would you say to
them? There's always people that are coming into whatever kind of career that you're in for the first time, right? There's always someone who's just started to be a film production or producer, or someone who's just become a designer, or someone who's just become an engineer. So those people will always have something that they want to hear because they're curious and really interested in information. So if you have any topic that's relevant to any industry, that would be your first place to look, is what is interesting to those people that are just starting out in an industry. For anything else, I tend to look at a little bit around trends. So for example, if someone was really interested in what might be a new talk in design, then there's been so much activity in Web3 or cryptocurrency. Those would be topics that have not yet been saturated. So if one were interested in such a thing, that would be a good place to start. So what's trending in whatever industry? And in this case, what's trending in design? Where might you find a new perspective? Of course, even old perspectives or even lived experience can make anything that's been spoken about more interesting or different from what has already been said. So I would encourage anyone who wants to speak, start with, what do you really like talking about? What are you super passionate about? I like to say, what the test is, if someone woke you up in the middle of the night and asked you a question about that thing, would you be comfortable giving an answer? If the answer is yes, start with that as your talk. and see how you can make it interesting if that's not immediately obvious.
Yeah, the middle of the night test, is that what you call it?
Yeah. I have many middle of the night tests.
That's great. And with that too, I know I said it was my last question. I'm kind of doing a follow-up on this that I hear a lot is like, is there some type of prerequisite then of like how much experience you need to have on it in order to speak about it? So if you're really excited about it, you can wake up in the middle of the night and talk about it. But maybe you haven't worked with it firsthand. Like do you have any gauge of like how much experience you need with something?
So I guess there are two views of any topic. There's, I'm just learning about this topic and I'm so excited to share my learning, in which case it could be something that existed already, but you're just learning it and want to talk about how you've learned or what you've learned in that topic. So an example would be, I don't know, how auto layout changed my life. Like auto layout, it has existed for ages. This is Figma auto layout for anyone who's not thinking, but someone who's just learning about auto layout, who talks about the process, or how they learned it, will be of interest, no matter what. And then if you already have had experience with the thing, then you can position yourself as more of an expert. And I'm sure there's something between the learning and the experience that you can also think about.
Awesome. That was truly my last question. So I want to say thank you so much, Chimmy. I am so grateful to have heard your story. I'm sure everyone else here feels the same way. And I'm really excited to share that and the advice with the larger Women Talk Design community. I wanted to share a couple of announcements on my part to everyone. So first and foremost, we would love to hear from you. So I'm going to drop feedback survey in the chat. That's always something we ask for. We generally try to reserve a couple minutes for folks to be able to connect. I know we're a small group today, and so we'll keep this open for a couple minutes if you want to connect here directly with Chimmy or anyone here rather than doing breakout rooms. But what I'm going to encourage you to do, if you are not already part of it, is to join Women Talk Design's community space. So this is the link right here. This is a place that we set up last year to give folks an opportunity to connect with one another outside of just attending our events. So you can head here and ask questions, you can offer advice, you can kind of join question forums that are happening, you can connect with other people in the Women Talk Design community. And so, Chimmy was talking about, we all have communities, and I think this is a great one, especially if you're looking for folks to practice with in front of. I heard recently we did an Instagram live with Shaniqua, who's someone in our community, and as she was practicing for an event, she said she posted there and said, hey, I need someone to practice in front of. Will anyone hop on a Zoom with me? And she got someone to do it that way. So I wanted to give a plug to that and to share to for everyone to connect there. And then we'll send some follow-ups too on some of the things that Chimmy's doing, a link to her past talk and her Women Talk Design speaker profile. And again, Chimmy, thank you so much. We are thrilled to have had you here to hear your story, and thank you for all the advice.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such fun. And all feedback welcome. You don't have to be only positive. I like an upward curve, don't forget.
Awesome.